Greg, on another hot day in the British summer. I hate complaining about it, but it's quite warm to be in jackets, and it's nice to see you in a tie finally. Got bantered into it.
I thought it's smart enough for you, Sean, just for once.
You're the man. You're the man. There's a lot to talk about today. I mean, first of all, obviously, there's the Global Air and Space Chiefs conference going on in London this week, 16th and 17th. With air and space power, it feels like in the ascendancy with the Israel conflict in Iran and the Ukraine Russia conflict. But there's a couple of other things I'd like to get into first. Well, the first of them is that this NAO audit, the National Audit Office audit into the F35 program, has actually set the media world alight. Now, of course, the NAO is there to hold government to account. And at the moment, it does appear that despite spending a huge amount of money on the F-35, recognizing it's very capable, we haven't actually got value for money out of it yet. What's your take on this story?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I smartened up today was partly because of the conference this week, and they'll be seeing a lot more of me and you, ideally with a tie on, and maybe we'll let the jackets stay off, but we'll see how the temperature goes. Yeah, look, you couldn't make things up in terms of timing. So the NEA report, I don't know whether it was scheduled for now but coming out just ahead of the conference, but perhaps more importantly, just after the government had made their announcement on the F-35A purchase. It's a bit of a damning report. How much of it is new? I mean, there were no surprises in there for me, but maybe for those less close to the program, it does make some pretty stark reading. Of course, we've got the majority of that fleet currently deployed out off the coast of Australia right now, off the coast of Queensland. So, it is in the news for other reasons. But the report does paint a particularly poor picture. Of course, it's looking at the program over its lifetime. So when you start looking at numbers in the 50, 60, 70 billion pounds worth, it's only right that people take notice. But you've got to remember that's over a 50-year program. And you kind of need to look at it in that light. And I think every platform we've ever brought into service has had a tough start.
Yeah, but I remember that because, I mean, obviously I flew the new Harrier, the GR5, the plastic pig, as we were calling it. And for the first couple of years, even the 3-kilogram practice bomb, that weapon beloved of training, we couldn't deliver that accurately because we were using fudge software. So I remember when the start of the Iraq war, even though we got these brand new aeroplanes, we couldn't go to war. And we were sent a load of banter back from people like you and the other forces about, what we were up to. And we were, basically very frustrated back at base. But what I find a bit shocking about the report, yes, I get, you and I both got grey hairs. We've seen this before. But weapons is the big one for me. I was a requirements manager on that program, and because you've got lots of nations buying into it, each of them wants to put their own weapons onto that aircraft. They've each got to be cleared, and therefore there has to be a prioritized list of when they enter that stream. And through a variety of reasons, largely because we kept delaying stuff because of financial reasons, things like Spear 3 and Meteor, which are sort of forward-firing weapons, are probably not going to be on the air platform until the 2030s. And I understand we're instead stuck using Paveway 4s, which you and I used to use, but they're basically gravity weapons, guided, but gravity weapons, which means you've got to get quite close to the target. And that's exactly what you don't want to be doing, because the Joint Strike Fighter is ideally meant to be something that you send into a high threat environment, only go as close as you need to, and then run away bravely.
Yeah, I'm still internally chuckling from your plastic pig analogy. Yeah, so look, any platform that comes in has problems with clearances, exactly as the F-35 has. But hopefully those take a couple of years, and they're normally just part of the teething problems of bringing either something into service too quickly or perhaps not thinking through all the challenges that you get. We've got that magnified here for a couple of reasons. One is this has been the longest introduction of a platform in history, because I remember taking delivery of the first one way back in 2010. So this has been around for 15 years. It's not a new platform in that sense. And the reason it's taken us so long in the UK is, we had two types. So we had Typhoon and F-35. So there wasn't quite the same race on that those nations that were replacing all their combat air with F-35. And we've sort of used the F-35 program as a bit of a cash machine, because by delaying purchases, what you do is you save a little bit of money in year. So we have stretched out this program over far too long a period. And obviously all the milestones are being missed. So that's the first problem. The honeymoon period has been far, far too long. Not that it's much of a honeymoon. And the second problem is the complexity of this platform is massive. The software dependency of this airplane and all the sensors that need to fuse are so high that getting something over the line is particularly more complicated. And with so many buyers out there, and with us not being a major purchaser, whether we like to or not, yes, we're a tier one, or were a tier one, but the US is the predominant buyer. They get priority on the clearances. And what we've done here is chosen a couple of UK weapons and tried to integrate them into a US controlled platform. And that's what's added the delay, which is why we are where we are.
It is interesting, though, that industry, certainly British industry, I think it's something like 15% of the programme comes back through British industry. So they seem very happy with it all. The trouble is, it seems a good example of sort of these legacy platforms, which are good for industry, but not necessarily good in terms of operational capability. Because I do take what you say, but about these teething troubles. But my worry is, I think we've spent, the NAO reckoned £11 billion so far. We're going to spend 71 billion through life. Admittedly, that's out to 2069. But as you say, over a decade into this program, if you were a normal taxpayer that never got anywhere near a fast jet, you'd think it was unreasonable that a decade later you still couldn't use the weapons that you designed. You knew that this for the aircraft, it's been in the gestation for so long. When you buy a new car, it can do anything. When you buy a new aircraft, it does seem to be a long time before we can actually send it to war.
Yeah, and that's entirely reasonable to have that view because it's true, and it's not great. I mean, we do have backups in that Typhoon still has a long-range strike capability, but it's the Typhoon that we're relying on for our national air defence. So we're putting a lot of weight on one platform in that regard. I think this point about industry is vital because I know the Labour government get this, that the growth agenda and the part that defence and particularly aerospace can play in that growth agenda is huge. We know how much money there is out there, whether it be in the big prime companies or whether it be in the smaller SMEs and the like, and the sort of ecosystem of the supply chain. There's a lot of controversy about this 15% figure because quite a lot of that 15%, yes, it's with BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce, but those factories are in America and they're under American directorships. So yes, they're British industries, but it's not British jobs. And quite a lot of that money ends up in the States. But then if you want to do business with America, as we well know now with the current president, you need to build in America. Otherwise, you don't get the business. So there's a real dichotomy here. Do our companies like BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce want to compete on the world stage? Answer, yes. Well, in order to do so, you've got to be in the big programs. And to be in the big programs, I'm afraid, you've got to be in bed with those partners, and that means being in bed with America. So the lessons for that and what that might mean for GCAP will be interesting, and recognizing the challenge here between getting value for money for the UK taxpayer, capability for the Air Force, and jobs and growth for the broader community is the trick to pull here. And it's difficult to get all of those three balanced.
No, I'm with you. And I did wonder whether some of the timing of this was also around GCAP, as you mentioned, the Global Combat Air Programme, because, there is always this debate about, do we develop our own national platforms that traditionally cost more money because you haven't got the economies of scale, but you do have a lot more control about what you put on it, when you put on it, and some of the secret capability that's locked away. And I do think this segues nicely on to the National Armaments Director. There was a huge fanfare, wasn't there, by the British government that this new post was going to be together. We haven't got a name yet, as far as having a quick search this morning, and it that this lady was going to be responsible for a defence industrial strategy, creating defence as the growth engine of our country. It had a massive responsibility on it, so it's no great surprise that they haven't actually found somebody to do it yet, because it sounds like almost an invidious role.
Yeah, it is a big challenge. It's such an important part of the reforms that were written within or even before the SDR. It's one thing to decide what to spend your money on. It's another thing entirely to spend that money wisely and better. And that is what this role is all about. Of course, it's not just equipment in the sort of military sense of the word. It's also the infrastructure. It's DSCL. It's the laboratories. I mean, it's a massive task for one individual. And I think perhaps that's the key here. The type of individual that you're going to want to run something this large and this challenging has got to be a heavy hitter. And if you want to get a heavy hitter away from a relatively good remuneration package elsewhere, then you're going to have to wait and time it such that you can get that person in. And I think you hit on this. I mean, all the money in the world might not compensate for the amount of work this person's going to take on. And reputationally, this is a massive task. I mean, if someone sat there, running a fairly large corporation that's doing quite well in the marketplace, it's a brave decision to then come in and do a job like this. But there's never been a more important time to get this job right, because we've not done procurement well in the past for a whole bunch of reasons. And I'm not blaming individuals, whether it's the organization, the way the system functions or whatever. But someone to come in and do that properly means we might just have to wait for the right person to come along. And I think that's probably what the delay is here.
Yeah, I think you may well be right. I think where my head is that I was chatting to somebody the other day who said, this feels like a once in a generational time for a vision around defense. It's not just a little bit more money. Actually, the Cold War ended. We had a peace dividend. That period is over. We're now in a new paradigm. That needs a new defense industrial strategy, not just a words, but actually some vision for how do we create a Team UK enterprise that can drive growth, not only domestically, but also into the export market. That has huge potential. The UK, for example, operational training. We've done loads of training for the Ukrainians. Our flying training system, the Central Flying School, the oldest in the world. We have a great deal of credibility, but how do you harness that and drive that forward? And that's not been something for the last 35 years the British government has had to get involved with. And therefore, how do you bring somebody in who's subservient to the government, but they have to come out with this vision? They put their reputation on the line, huge amounts of risk involved. The economy at the moment is going the wrong direction, whereas spending needs to go up. This 3.5%, 5% mantra. I just see the vectors going the wrong direction at the moment, because vision without funding is hallucination. This needs to be gripped. It needs to be gripped at the very highest level of government. And then potentially this new role, this National Armament Director, might stand a chance of delivering a fraction of what the potential is of this great country.
Yeah, and I think that's the other factor at play here. I mean, if it is a heavy hitter, and it should be, then that person's not going to be blind to the challenge they're about to face. And if it was me, and it's not going to be, by the way, if it was me, I'd be sitting down with the Chancellor, the Department of Trade, the Prime Minister, and the Secretary of State of Defence saying, I'll do this job, but here are my conditions. Here are what I need from you. Here are the permissions I need and the authorities I need. And I think there's some serious questions here for the Treasury to answer in particular, because if this is about growth, then why wait for the MOD to step up with the money to fund that growth? And why can't we get that money from elsewhere? Now, whether that's from the taxpayer in advance, and we inject money into it. We certainly do the same thing with major infrastructure programs. So why doesn't this count under the same sort of benefits? Or whether it's private equity, that brings all sorts of other challenges, as we well know with other programs we've done in the past. And probably the answer is it's going to be a little bit of everything. But having the ability to pull together all those threads across government is going to be the challenge. Just putting a new person in there and coming up with a wonderful change program written by McKinsey, that ain't going to cut it. This has got to be a genuine reform with a capital R. And it's got to go far, far broader than just the MOD.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see whether the appointment actually dovetails with a true vision for where defence needs to be, because it feels like without that, I'm not sure I'd volunteer for a role. Because as you say, if you want somebody in that post who's got the connections, the WASTA, the robustness, the credibility, they're going to be very valued outside. And I saw something about £500,000 a year salary, and you went, okay, if the MOD that's big, for industry that is not. And I know they can't. Okay, there may be some knighthoods around or stuff like that, but actually, without having the robust political support, I think it's destined for difficulty. Anyway, that segues again nicely onto the main event for us, I guess, is the Air and Space Power Association. It is this Global Air Chiefs Conference happening in London. It does feel, I'm not the only one who thinks that this feels like the era for air and space power, with everything else that's going on. 50 global chiefs, so loads of industry, academia coming together. But what are the aims of the conference if it's to avoid just being a talking shop?
Yeah, well, the conference has been going for a long time now, and of course, there are many conferences around the world in various different places that follow very similar themes and very similar topics. This one is a little bit unique in that it does bring together more chiefs, I believe, in one place at any one time. I don't know exact numbers today, but we're certainly hoping for greater than 50. And beyond that, there'll be representatives from plenty of other air forces. So we are definitely getting a cross section of the community in one place. It helps, of course, that there's an air show at the end of it with the weekend at Ret'd with Fairford. So, and the weather is great, so all should be well. But this is really an opportunity, and it's if you add up Ret'd, there's a good 4 or 5 days here for these individuals to really have some quite intimate conversations. So there'll be what we hear at conference, and you'll be able to follow that on the ASPA website. But there's also what you'll what will be going on behind the scenes, the conversations that take place between the UK and the US, between European chiefs and the UK, between NATO nations as a group, and maybe those beyond further in the sort of broader sphere in the Indo-Pacific. So it's a marvelous opportunity. Of course, it brings industry in as well. And you'd say, well, that would be the case, wouldn't it? But I think that there's a greater challenge now for industry and the military to work better together. I'm not going to say closer together. Industry has its own drivers, normally driven by the shareholder, and understandably so. But there's never been a time to be more joined up and more coherent if you're going to make this industrial strategy work and still deliver capability at the pace you need it because of the threats we face immediately. And this conference is going to address all of that. What are the threats? How are we going to meet them? Where does AI and autonomy fit into all of that? And hearing views from around the world, from different places. I think at least 5 European chiefs, are speaking at conference this year. We've got the Australian chief speaking and obviously the American chief. So we are going to hear an extremely diverse set of views. The good thing is Air and Space Power is a pretty joined up bunch, actually. And I think you're going to see a lot of coherence, which is a good thing. It's an important thing for air and space. So yeah, we are going to hear, I hope, some pretty hard hitting. And we're going to dive into the home truths, but more importantly, try and figure out where do we go from here, because that is the real challenge.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that seems to, talking to colleagues, that seem to be continuity, and my read into that is, as you say, air and space is pretty well connected, but events politically, particularly the far side of the Atlantic, do seem to have upset the apple cart a little bit. And I do think part of what's going to be happening, not necessarily in the front of house, but as you say, those chats behind the scenes over coffee, over a glass of wine, will be around what does that enduring relationship look like? How does NATO stick together? How does the Americans, who frankly, as they demonstrated so ably with that attack on the Iranian facilities, that they managed, that only they in the world can mount that sort of air and space power capability. So I do think there's going to be some interesting stuff. What I don't understand is there does appear to be quite a lot of concern around people being held accountable. In other words, the government sort of stepped in and tried to just put a little bit of most of the uniformed speakers from the Royal Air Force will not be able to be attributable. And there does seem to be an element to the government trying to control the narrative a little bit. What was your take on that?
Yeah, we've seen that sort of prior to the defence review, where understandably during the review process, everyone was being, should we say, quieter than usual. We've sort of seen that carried on. And I think that's because primarily, governments are governments. They run, and whether the conference and air power likes it or not, the politics of this is always in the background. We know that the UK in particular has a fairly large challenge, but let's be honest, so do most countries, particularly European ones. We're all under pressure to spend more money. We've all taken a little bit of a holiday for the last 20 years. America has woken us up to that fact, somewhat rudely, but woken us up nonetheless. And I think, by the way, you will see quite a joined up conversation in the conference between Americans and Brits and Europeans. Airmen tend to think very similarly. Military people are actually far more joined up than you might believe it to be the case if you just read the newspapers and listen to the politics. But governments want to control the narrative. It's a horrible word, but you can't avoid using it. And the narrative is what is the story? The story is, yes, defence isn't in a great place. It wasn't our fault. Here's some more money. Let's go make it better. And here's our reform and our proposals. Now, on the surface, that's exactly what Labour have done. And they probably couldn't have done much more. The question is, well, are you spending enough? And could you not spend a bit more? And if you aren't spending a bit more, what are the gaps that you've left behind? Those are quite difficult conversations to have in public because you want to control that messaging, partly because you don't want to be seen as failing. And why would governments want to be seen as failing? Partly because you don't want to admit all your errors to the enemy. Why would you want to do that? You want to be showing strength, not weakness. So there's this delicate balance between telling the truth and controlling the story to a degree. Now, is government trying to hold on a bit too hard at the moment? I think in the UK, we are a bit unique. I mean, I've follow all the defence commentators out there, as I know you do, on social media. And we do seem to beat ourselves up quite a lot. I mean, the amount of noise after the NEO or the F35 was quite deafening. And from some people, really quite damning. Scrap them now and get rid of them and let's move on. Well, move on to what? So, and for militaries, they have to work with what they've got. They can't just keep throwing things away and buy new every time. So, yeah, I understand why number 10, and maybe this is as much about the PR element and the spin doctors, as we like to talk about, trying to over control the narrative. Personally, I think it's a mistake. I think it never works. And I think the military will find a way of communicating the things they need to communicate, both internally and externally, and manage within that control mechanism, if you like.
My concern is that the more we talk about this, the more the military sort of hunker down and only talk about capability. The way you've described it, give us more money and we'll buy more kit. And you go, we're both taxpayers. We recognise that there isn't a bottomless pit of money, and therefore, if you're going to spend more money on defence, which you need to, how do you get that to contribute to be a growth engine for this country? And it feels to me that means that it's not just the military involved in that conversation. It has to be industry, academia, and the like, because if you're going to create an engine, for example, if we're going to make a success out of military training, if we can get other people involved in that training, the cost for the UK comes down. We can make exports, weapons. We have some MBDA provides some weapons under the complex weapons program. The more we sell, the cheaper they get for the MOD. That is a teamwork approach. And it feels to me that the only way we're going to be able to deliver any form of growth engine is if the military are directly involved, almost, I know it's a horrible word, almost becoming salesmen for British industry in the defence space, because that's the way that we're going to get cost-effective capability and drive it in this country. And that's not going to be achieved by trying to stifle the voices in defence. It's going to be achieved by creating a construct and a mechanism where we truly can deliver the best of breed that this country is able to do.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I'll just tell you a little story which is sort of indicative of the situation they find themselves in now. After the 2010 SDR, I found myself at one group handling a 50% reduction of our combat air squadrons. It was not a great time to be in the Air Force. You remember it well. I begged to go and do a media PR Q&A to try and sell the positives, what the aeroplanes were now capable of doing, what our people were capable of doing, the decades of operations that we'd done out of sight, out of mind, and the complexity that we were dealing with, and all the positive messaging that I thought we needed to push out if we were going to continue to recruit and retain people. Otherwise, it was just constantly bad news. I gave a presentation for an hour. 59 minutes of that presentation was on positives. I got one question about the size and our comparison to Belgium. I think I've mentioned this before. And what made the headlines? The 1 minute soundbite that was about, size comparisons with Belgium. And this is the problem. We've got a media that is only after one version of the truth. And it's the bad story. It's the headline story. We don't want to tell the good news stuff. Now, to be fair, there's not a lot of good news out there, and that doesn't help. If you're trying to peddle good news, and you can see it now, you can see the social media running overtime, pushing the high mast deployment of the carrier down in Australia. And then an NEO report comes out and says, well, it doesn't matter because they're all rubbish. And you go, oh. So I do understand why governments try and squeeze this to try and control that one bad story. I just think holding on too tight and squeezing to stop that one bad story getting out, you then block 10 good ones.
No, I agree. But you and I both know, because we have some experience of dealing with the media, the danger is if the answer is no, what's the question? Everybody becomes just a bit more hunkered down. I guess my point is, in the absence of having a vision of a strategy for driving that growth agenda, living with the bad news stories, but at least in your heart, you've got a view of where the future lies and the sunny uplands lies, and everybody's bound into that. I think, because you and I, even though we left the military some time ago, you still cut us. We still bleed RAF blood. We still care. There's a huge amount of people in this country that still care about the military capability. They care about jobs. They care about their taxes. All of this can be bound together. And the danger is in the void that we currently seem to have. Let's part the National Armaments Director if that does materialize. But then all you end up doing is people throwing spears going, well, why are you doing this? And I think things like this conference, in my own view, you get together some very, very capable, experienced individuals. What a fantastic petri dish for generating some really innovative, capable ideas. But how do we get that engaged with the government rather than the government sort of feeling a bit uncomfortable with it?
Yeah, and I do think we need to think about how it looks on the outside, externally from the country too, because we want Putin to be fearful of NATO air power for good reason, because we want to deter him from doing something stupid. And so there is a balance here to be struck between, woe is me, everything's awful, as opposed to actually, no, we're not as good as we could be, and we're not as good as we should be, but this is what we are capable of doing. And I think that's the challenge here. If government had announced yesterday an increase of spending on defence to 4%, immediately, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Now it would be, okay, so what are we going to spend it on? It's because the government, let's be honest, they probably know that they need to spend more. In order to fix all the problems, they need to spend more. So and Rachel Reeves is sitting there going, well, I've got a real trick to pull here because I can't spend more because I'm spending it all on this, 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 and this. This is what gets us re-elected. That doesn't. So how do I manage that really imbalanced argument? And I think the question for us at conference is how do we make sure that we are investing in the things we definitely need? And there are things we need more of. There's no doubt about that. Most of those are not hidden. And if you read the SDR, they're written all the way through it. So no one's keeping that much of a secret. So the question is so what can you do in the intervening period to make your air forces more effective and therefore a greater deterrent for the intervening 5-10 years before some of that money kicks in? I think we saw France just yesterday announce a doubling of their budget from 2017 to 2027 will double. So we are seeing people now beginning to change the language. But the theme of the conference is about integration because the sum of the parts here can be so much stronger. And I think staying focused on that and understanding what that means and not getting all Little Britain and it's not sovereign, it's not this, it's not that. Yeah, but we are part of a much bigger machine and it's quite a powerful machine. So start listening to all those voices and start adding up the sum of the parts because they are impressive.
We're going to have a lot of fun over the next couple of days at conference, aiming to do a podcast each day, just our reflections on it, taking a few views from the people there. But we, of course, are free from any of the restrictions. So we look forward to being able to tell it as it is and also warts and all. But Greg, really looking forward to it.
Exactly. And I shall wear my tie. Keep you happy.
About time.